Let's get peppy. This is episode 81. Very excited to go. This is Dr. Dave, the most patient doctor in the business. Hi, Dave.
Hi, I am Dr. David Smith from the University of Sydney. I've learned that I've got some students who listen to this, so I just want to make it clear. If I say anything in this podcast that is inconsistent with what I say in class, what I say in class takes precedent, okay?
That's pathetic commitment to the cause, Dr. Dave. Do they at least get extra credit for listening to this podcast? They deserve something.
No, they don't.
They deserve a reward at least. Fair enough. Okay, and I'm Chaz. I'm from Planet America, which you can watch on IV or Facebook. You know that by now, probably. A couple of quick updates. First of all, on false advertising laws, we talked about that last week. I said the commenters would take care of it. Of course they did. We have the best commentators going around. Thanks, Uncle Phil and Jay Hawkins. They point people to Title 15 US Code, sections 52 to 54. It's all got all you need if you're interested. It is against the law. You are right.
Look, if every comment section was as good as our comment section, I wouldn't be opposed to comment section.
Talking about which, an update on that, precisely that, the comment section, the Australian social media law you just described. There was a very funny little bit on the I saw the other day where it was, I think it was the Australian, or certainly a News Limited paper, which was arguing that there needed to be a Section 230 kind of law in Australia to protect places like News Limited from these kinds of issues about being responsible for commenters on the internet. These, of course, are the same people who have been waging a war against Section 230 in America through the Wall Street Journal and so forth, which I found very amusing. As someone who's a bit of an extremist when it comes to Section 230, I like it very much. Another little bit of update from way back. We've talked about Ron DeSantis and his mask mandate travails with schools trying to ban mandates. I want to emphasise, under his regimes, you'd be allowed to have masks, but a school wouldn't be able to force you to have a mask. It's been going through court. The latest toss and turn has been that now he's won. Well, the courts have just favoured him again. So now it is that once again it is illegal to have mask mandates in Florida for schools, but that's still going through courts. I'm sure it will toss and turn one more time.
You mean twist and turn?
Yeah,
toss and turn is what you do when you can't sleep.
And that is exactly what I do when I think about the ins and outs of the law in Florida, Dr. Dave. It keeps me up at night, keeps me worried. I'm sure it's the same with you. Exactly. Let's talk about. Oh, I think Dr. Dave actually froze then, but I'm going to act like he actually just gave a pregnant pause for the people who can't see this, who are just listening on the podcast. Just pretend Dr. Dave showed me contempt. Let's go into the new stuff, though. First of all, California. The recall was this week. You gave us the preview last week. Do you want to give us the post view? What are your thoughts about what happened in California?
Well, there's a lot of disagreement about what this actually means. So as you've probably heard by now, Gavin Newsom won that overwhelmingly. He didn't get recalled. I don't know what the final numbers are, and I think we still don't know.
We won't know for weeks.
Numbers are, but I think he won by 30 points or so, or nearly 30 points, which is just slightly more than he won the last gubernatorial election by. So what does this actually mean then? There are certainly Democrats who are hoping that, as we discussed last week, this potentially offers a strategic path through to the 2022 midterms, which is essentially making every candidate's running mate into Donald Trump, as Larry Elder could easily be done, focusing on national issues such as abortion and women's rights and things like that. And COVID. Yeah. So actually being able to have that high democratic motivation under circumstances where you otherwise wouldn't expect high democratic motivation. So that's certainly the lesson that a lot of Democrats want to take from this. Others have urged a lot of caution. saying California and this recall election in particular were very unique. Not only is California about the fourth or so bluest state in the country, the structure of the recall election made it so that this Republican who was out of step, even with most California Republicans, was the one who sort of got to the top and was able to be painted as the opposition. So a lot of people would say there's really nothing in this California election to give Democrats much hope. I suppose I would say that this was a bar that Democrats needed to clear to have any hope whatsoever for the 2022 midterm elections. So, had they lost this or had this been close, you would have been very, very worried if you're a Democrat. I don't know if you've got reason to be overwhelmingly optimistic now. I suppose the scenario a lot of Democrats would have had in mind was that shock special election victory in, was it 2009 or 2010? Scott Brown in Massachusetts winning Ted Kennedy's old seat, which not only made things very, very difficult for Barack Obama, who was trying to get Obamacare through the Senate at that point, but that also was basically a harbinger of what was to come in the 2010 election, which was a red wave. Now, if we're to take this as analogous, the fact that Newsom won this by as much as he would win in a normal gubernatorial race means that a red wave probably isn't coming. But of course, it doesn't need to be a red wave for Republicans to win. A sort of a red flush, I suppose, would be all that it would take to change the balance of power in both houses. Perhaps something, it's been widely pointed out, look, not every candidate's going to be Larry Elder. Not every candidate can be painted as Donald Trump. But unfortunately, the way the Republican Party's going, they are going to get a lot of Larry Elder type candidates this time around, or at least people who have transformed themselves into Larry Elder type. So certainly, I think the Democrats might be able to do better on this basis than they otherwise would have expected, given everything that is going on. And obviously, this is still a long time away. A lot could still happen. So I do expect to see those tactics being replicated as much as they can. But you'd still expect Republicans to be in a very strong position to win the midterms. Yeah,
all I would add to that is that, firstly, it's an interesting tactic from the Democrats to try and make it about Trump, because they'll try and make the opposition candidates about Trump, because that is a tactic that they will be aided in by the Republicans themselves. Yes. They will be trying to make it about Trump as well to get their base out, because there is nothing against Republican voters out better than Trump. And Trump will be trying to help as well. Trump will be going around making it all about him as well.
Well, Trump was a presence in the California election. Sure, his main role was to insist that preemptively that it was rigged, but he was there.
Yeah, so it's a peculiar situation where everyone is making a bet that if the same thing happens, they will succeed, and we will find out who is right.
Yeah, and because Trump has made it the litmus issue that, to be a loyal Republican now, you have to be constantly complaining that the 2020 election was stolen. That which Steve Bannon insists, noted strategic, as we've discussed before, noted strategic stopped clock, Steve Bannon, has repeatedly insisted that this is the path to victory. But we'll see.
The other thing I'd say, I mentioned this on the show, but I'll mention this here for those who didn't see the show just briefly, because most people haven't mentioned it, is I'd said COVID before. I really think COVID played quite a large role in this, and whether it extends to 2022, we'll see. Because California is currently 48th in America for case rates. It's doing really, really well. And I think it's not a coincidence that Gavin Newsom came up for a recall at the time when California was doing very, very badly in COVID. Yes. And then they went better, and he did well in the polling. And then he went badly in the polling when it got really close, when they were doing really badly again. And now they're doing well again, and he pissed it home. So I think that makes a big difference.
I think so. And also 2/3 of Californians support mask mandates.
Yeah.
Which is, those are going to be much higher numbers than you would find. Support vaccine mandates, which are, the big issue.
But briefly, before we move on, something which a lot of people have been talking about as well is I think everyone agrees that the California recall process is a bit weird. The fact that someone who wins 20% of the vote can beat a governor who got 49% of the vote. Do you have any preferred methods of reform? Because I think they're going to reform it in some capacity. Do you have some preferred method that you'd like to see it reformed?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot here, Chaz. You're going to spend years devising an alternative system with committees and experts, and you're asking me here?
Let me tell you my way, and you can ignore me while I say it, and you can think about your way in the meantime. Okay. Although I'm not going to take long, it's pretty simple, and that is I don't think you need complicated electoral methods. I think the reason why the recall election should exist is if you've got a governor who is out of control, and you don't want to have to wait 3 years to get rid of them for whatever reason, you should be able to get rid of that governor. But I don't think you should be able to overthrow an election with a minority of the vote. And so for that reason, I don't think you should be able to elect Larry Elder as a replacement. The recall election should be getting rid of the governor. And then the lieutenant governor takes over. That's why you have a lieutenant governor. And then when that lieutenant governor becomes governor, they appoint a new lieutenant governor who will take over if that governor then gets recalled. You use a recall election to get rid of someone who needs to be gotten rid of. And I think if you did that, then it would stay in the same party largely, which would give no incentive for these extremely partisan activist style recalls, and then make it much less of a joke. That's my personal view. I think that makes more sense.
I support the Chaz proposal. Okay. I proudly endorse the Chaz proposal.
Yeah, and if you're in a one-party state like California, the Democrats bugger it up that much, then you beat them in the election when you're meant to beat them. But in the meantime, you get rid of the dictator, whoever that is, and you replace them with lieutenant governor.
I support the Licciardello recall.
Excellent. Let's get into it. That's a real first. Dave supports something I have to say unreservedly. I love it. More of that, please. Let's talk about the Millie stuff with Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, that book. I got a few things to say about this, and then I'll let you into it. We talked about it on the show, but I want to go into more detail now because that's what the podcast is for. First of all, I have no time for Bob Woodward generally. I think he's
How many books does he have to write per presidency?
It's amazing, isn't it? It's like every 6 months. He's just pumping out books. I'll tell you who's happy about it. My daughter is 11. She loves this stuff. Draw whatever conclusions you like from that.
Wow.
But apart from
get her to read some Robert Caro.
It's all right.
If she likes, get her to read Robert Caro's books. If she likes Bob Woodward, I think she'll love Robert Caro. I mean, it's a bit historically distant, like his major subject is LBJ. But if she likes, books about the inside of the White House,
that will certainly keep her going, Robert Caro. That's a lengthier book than Bob Woodward, I'll tell you that. There's a piece out there by Tanner Colby from 2013 that I'll put in the homework, which I think actually puts quite well. When I say homework, just look in the blurb under the YouTube video or the Facebook video and you'll find it there, which I think sums up what I think about him. So I'll just read out a quote from it. Getting the facts is only part of the equation. You have to present those facts in context and in proportion to other facts in order to accurately reflect reality. It's here that Woodward fails. Over and over during the course of my reporting, I'd hear a story that conflicted with Woodward's account in Wired. He wrote a lot about Wired, this Woodward book. I'd run back to Woodward's index, look up the offending passage and realise that, well, no, he'd put down the mechanics of the story more or less as they'd happened. But he'd so mangled the meaning and the context that his version had nothing to do with what I concluded had actually transpired. Like a funhouse mirror, Woodward's prose distorts what it purports to reflect and misses the bigger picture. Now, that's my take. He gets the facts right, but the meaning wrong. And I think that this might be an example, this Millie story. Now, so I'll go into details now.
Okay, this was a long wind-up. It's good.
Yeah, that's right.
Good. I like where this is going.
Okay, part one, the China calls. All right, now first call, October 30. The quote apparently was, General Lee, I want to assure you that the American government is stable and everything is going to be okay, Millie said to his Chinese counterpart. We are not going to attack or conduct any kinetic operations against you. General Lee, you and I have known each other now for 5 years. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It's not going to be a surprise. Okay, now Trump called that treason. Like I said on the show, if you take the angle that Woodward's gone with it, that he has explicitly said to Lee that he will warn him when Trump attacks China, then that actually is treason, because it is actually giving aid to an enemy who at that point in time would be China. If they're declaring war on China, that's by definition an enemy of America if they're at war. And if he's giving aid and comfort to the enemy, that is helping China. So if that is what he's doing, saying to China, hey, don't worry, I'm going to warn you, but before we attack you, you and me, we're going to go behind Trump's back. Yes, that would actually be treason. But that's not what he's saying at all. Let me go into details. First of all, Axios said the day after this story came out that mid-October 2020, the Chinese were getting bad intelligence, a combination of wag the dog conspiracy thinking and bad intel from bad sources. At the same time, a long-planned deployment to Asia had been moved up a couple of weeks earlier than previously planned to accommodate COVID quarantine protocols. So, Defence Secretary Esper was worried that this could escalate. So Esper directed his policy office to issue a back-channel message to the Chinese to reassure them America had no intention of seeking a military confrontation. The message was, don't overread what you're seeing in Washington, we have no intention to attack, and let's keep lines of communication open. And then Milley, according to Axios sources, followed that up later in the month with his own call to support Esper's strategy. And that seems to have been accepted. Now, two journalists disagree on this. Jennifer Griffin from Fox says that there were 15 people on the video teleconference calls, including State Department and Defense Department people. Josh Rogan from the Washington Post says the calls were just with joint staff, but no Defense Department or State Department people. Either way, multiple people on the calls. No one's going rogue. No one's going behind anyone's back. They're making video calls with lots of other people watching, right? Okay, yeah. That's a key. Also, quote from Josh Rogan, the one who said there was less support. He said Milley was absolutely not going rogue. Esper took the initiative on this in October. Esper asked his own policy folks to back-channel the message. Milley's message followed Esper's. Okay, so there's no treason going on here.
I've got to say, this does sound a good deal less treasonous.
Yes, what he's doing is following the policy of the Defense Secretary. That's exactly what he's meant to do. Now, maybe Trump was out of the loop, in which case Esper is the one who is not committing treason, but Esper is the one who's undermining his own commander-in-chief.
Hey, let's just take a step back.
Yeah.
It would be treason if there actually was a war and they actually did warn the China about an attack.
That's right.
Saying, if there's a war, we're going to warn you, is something quite different and serves a strategic purpose apart from predicting what's actually going to happen. So them just doing that, even if it was exactly as Woodward reported, would not have been treason.
Yeah, no, that's a good call. That's a good call. Yeah, because, like trying to stop the war from happening in the first place is different to saying, oh, what we say we might do is exactly what we are going to do. Let's pretend that happened in the alternative. Okay, the other thing is that, now that's all Esper, right? There's also Chris Miller, who was around for the second call. He was the acting Secretary of Defense.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. There were far too many Millers.
There really were. There really were. So Esper's is there for the October 30 call. For the January 8 call, that's Chris Miller, right? He told Fox News that Milley, there's Millers and Millies, that Milley went rogue, he said. He called the calls disgraceful and unprecedented act of insubordination, and he did not and would not ever authorise the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to make those calls. But that same person, Chris Miller, told Politico that Milley almost certainly told him he was going to call his Chinese counterpart, but he didn't recall getting a detailed readout of the call after. Quote from Chris Miller. Looking back, I imagine there was a perfunctory exchange between us and our staffs about coordinating phone calls and messages for the day. I don't recall the specifics, and it certainly wasn't in a detailed or more formal way. It was more perfunctory routine. That's not treason, Dr. Dave.
It's not. And look, that absolutely does not pass the Dr. Dave treason test.
And I gotta say, Miller, not Milley, has proven to be very flaky in a lot of his accounts.
Absolutely.
For a lot of stories over the last year. So if there are two sources and one of them is Miller, I'm trusting the other source. Anyway, And Politico did speak to another official who said that Millie asked permission from Miller before making the call. This person was in the room for that meeting. They said Millie also briefed the Secretary's office after the call. Quote, we discussed beforehand and after his call with his Chinese counterpart. Okay, so that's the first one. Do you have any comments to make about that? I think that's a complete overreaction from Woodward.
I spend a lot of time every day thinking about who's committing treason and who isn't, and I declare that Millie has not committed treason.
Okay, so that's a beat up from Woodward, in my view. Okay, part 2, the nuclear instructions. All right, yeah, this is the other one. Woodward and Gosta write that Millie, after January 6, was certain, quote, that Trump had gone into a serious mental decline in the aftermath of the election, with Trump now all but manic, screaming at officials and constructing his own alternate reality about endless election conspiracies. So Millie, this is from the article, so Millie called a secret meeting in his Pentagon office on January 8 to review the process for military action, including launching nuclear weapons. Speaking to senior military officials in charge of the National Military Command Center, the Pentagon's war room, Millie instructed them not to take orders from anyone unless he was involved. That was all commentary I just read, Dr. Dave. This is the quote. No procedure, Millie told the officers, according to the book. No matter what you're told, you do the procedure, you do the process, and I'm part of the procedure. Millie told the officers, according to the book. He then went around the room, looked at each officer in the eye and asked them to verbally confirm they understood. Got it? Millie asked, according to the book. Yes, sir. Millie considered an oath. The author's right. Okay.
I love that, right? I love that little detail because it's like if you're sitting in the exit aisle of a plane and they require everyone to give verbal confirmation while looking you in the eye, that you understand what they think.
Yes.
The safety aisle of the White House.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason I read all that commentary around the quote is because I think the commentary colours your views of the quote. And I think if you look at the quote by itself, and I'm about to, you see it means something very different to what the commentary suggested. Once again, Woodward taking things, in my view, to mean differently to what they actually mean. First of all, I should say New Yorker's Suzanne Glasser actually said that they even got the quotes wrong. She said that Millie told them to make sure there were no unlawful orders from Trump and not to carry out any such orders without calling him first. That's a very different thing to what they were reporting. But let's leave that aside. I'm happy to take Woodward's quotes because I think they still support what I'm about to say. The quote was, no matter what you are told, you do the procedure. You do the process, and I'm part of that procedure. Okay, that's the quote. That's true. This is the procedure. Air Force Doctrine Publication 372, Nuclear Operations. Quote, to maintain credibility, airmen must be ready at all times to respond to requests from the President and his or her advisors via the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to employ nuclear weapons. The President may direct the use of nuclear weapons through an execute order via the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the combatant commanders and ultimately to the forces in the field exercising direct control of the weapons. So yes, he was part of the standard procedure. What he said was literally true. They put the colour on of quote, this is their quote, this is their commentary. Millie instructed them to not take orders from anyone unless he was involved. No, he said, follow procedure. Procedure is, I'm the one who tells you. That's the procedure. If I don't tell you, it hasn't followed the proper procedure. That's what he said. That's a very different thing, right? And this is important because remember at this point in time, almost everyone who Trump had appointed was acting. And usually not officially either. They're usually unlawfully acting.
That's true, yes.
Chris Miller was not a proper acting Secretary of Defense.
No.
They didn't have a proper acting Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence either. They didn't have a proper acting Department of Defense Chief of Staff either. These are all just parachuted in, just hacks. And so you can understand why Millie would be worried about someone who isn't even supposed to be there swanning in and trying to throw their dick around a bit. And so I can understand why he would have wanted just make very sure people understand what the process is meant to be, which is the President talks to me and then I talk to you. That's the process. That's how it's meant to work. That's not the way they sold it. And so I think bottom line, while both stories were if what they said was correct, potentially treasonous, yes. I think they've just sprinkled some mayo on both of those stories to the extent where they've destroyed them completely. And so that's my take on all that Millie stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I did note Tim O'Brien, who's one of Trump's best biographers, wrote this article in Bloomberg saying, no, Millie, he wasn't mentally deteriorating. That's how he's always been. It's funny looking at the sort of transformation of Millie, who, of course, appeared in fatigues on the streets of DC during the suppression of Black Lives Matter protests, and then appears to have just regretted that moment so much that he then spent the next 6 months being this sort of, it's a very vigilant figure who believed, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was his responsibility to make sure that the military had nothing to do with any potential kind of Trump coup attempt. Millie now has become such a liberal hero that, Ben and Jerry's could name a flavour after it. Millie Vanilli.
Very, very good. Very good. We're just going to end on that punchline? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Right. Okay, well, I'm going to do something you've never heard before and you'll never hear again to mark that wonderful pun. And that is, I am going to compliment Tom Cotton because I know. But honestly, he's earned this because in the middle of all this bullshit...
This isn't the first time you've complimented Tom Cotton.
Are you sure? I don't remember. Maybe the commenters can dig it up.
The old memory banks. I'm sure you've complimented him.
I don't feel like I've complimented him before.
Oh, that's right. No, you did. You said that he was right about Wuhan.
Oh, that's true. That's true. He was. He was.
No, I think the jury's still out on that.
No. But what I was saying was that he was completely misinterpreted. He was being very specific what he said, which was we don't know about this, we don't know about that, and people were interpreting that as him saying, it's definitely lab leak. And
I would say that's because he willfully inserted himself into a context where that was the only interpretation.
Yeah. Well, look, I cut him some slack. But anyway, this does not require cutting him slack because this was Tom Cotton turning up on Fox and Friends where Brian Kilmeade was amped up to the point where I literally thought he wanted to shove Millie in one of those Austin Powers style tanks with sharks with lasers on their heads. Brian Kilmeade was literally, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, try and watch the video just for this clip to see Brian Kilmeade literally jumping out of his chair to criticise Millie. Like he's so amped up. He's on some kind of drug of hate. Anyway, and Tom Cotton, in the middle of this context, said this.
Senator, you have to be just flabbergasted by this. We're going to let you know if we're planning to attack you. We'll tell you when and where so you can get ready.
Well, Ainsley, this book raises some serious concerns. I have to say some of the allegations seem somewhat far-fetched to me. But General Milley and Secretary Austin are going to be testifying in front of Congress in just a few days, and we'll address these concerns. We don't want to jump to conclusions yet, but we'll certainly vet them and see exactly what happened.
Senator, he's got to speak. Senator,
have a principle of civil.
Senator, this is too big for this. We can't wait for him to testify. If this guy is selling us out to China, going behind the President of the United States, and he's still in power, fresh off of the catastrophe in Afghanistan, he's got to address this.
Brian, I know he will address it, and we'll ensure that he addresses it. But this is one of those claims, obviously, that seems a little far-fetched, the idea that an American military general is going to warn an adversary if an attack is coming. As you say, when Donald Trump was never even thinking about a military attack against China, the whole thing is pretty far-fetced.
Yes, it's the living version of that meme, worst person that you know made a good point.
Yes. But and what he's referring to is on September 28th they're going to have a hearing with Millie, and I'm sure this will be...
Questions are going to be so bad. Like, these hearings have really been pretty terrible.
But by the way, control room, if you can hear me, if there's anyone there, Dr. Dave has a dialogue box over his face at the moment. It'd be if you guys can end that.
I think that was probably deliberate, Jazz.
Yes, anyway, I will keep on going while hopefully...
I think it was today or yesterday, the Idaho Senator Risch, whose first name I'm forgetting.
Jim.
Kept asking Anthony Blinken whether someone in the White House had a button that cut off Joe Biden.
Yes.
Blinken kept saying no, and he kept asking him because of this conspiracy theory. You know, as I've said before, because Biden is a very difficult figure to hate. Right-wing media invents these conspiracy theories that he is the puppet of other forces who are easier for them to hate. And so now there's this theory that someone in the White House has a button that cuts him off.
Yeah, I'll just play the clips so people know what we're talking about. Not Jim Risch, but of the video he's referring to. Just have a look at that.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
One of the things that I've been working on with some others is...
Okay, so as you can see, it's pretty obvious what was going on there. Biden had a scheduled session which ended, and so they cut away from him on YouTube, the live stream. He wasn't censored. Someone didn't come and put tape over his mouth. He just kept on talking because he didn't give a shit about what was on YouTube. And he was just having a conversation, and the session ended. That was all there. Just like Dave's session might end in a second if someone doesn't fix this dialogue box over his mouth, which I'm getting worried about.
I've also got a timer coming up saying there's only 7 minutes and 55 seconds left.
This is what I'm talking about. I don't know why that would be the case, but anyway, we may have to cut in the middle of this podcast and come back another time. I don't know. In the meantime, why don't you tell us in the 7 minutes before we find out whatever the hell is about to happen, why don't you tell us about the AUKUS situation? Because Scotty got in the news.
Well, this is really interesting because this, as far as I'm aware, came as a complete surprise to almost everyone. This announcement of a new trilateral agreement between Australia, the UK, and the US that involves a whole lot of military technology sharing. So everything from quantum computing to cybersecurity to artificial intelligence. But the big first splash on this is getting Australia nuclear submarines. Now, to people from outside of Australia who might be listening, Australia's had this struggle with submarines that's been going on for decades now. We've got 6 submarines known as Collins-class submarines that were commissioned during the 80s. They're sort of widely seen as inadequate now for all kinds of reasons. There have been all kinds of debates about whether to upgrade them or replace them. Eventually, what we actually did was to get a contract with France to build 12 new conventionally propelled submarines, but this is a type of submarine that the French had never built before, so there were all kinds of cost overruns. It was going to take a long time. The earliest submarine was going to appear in 2030. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue yesterday, we get this announcement that that deal is off, okay, at a cost of $2.4 billion to back out of that contract, and France is not happy about it. Australia is instead going to get at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines from the US for an unspecified cost, which we won't even know for 18 months. God knows how long it'll actually get to take these things. But the point is we are getting nuclear submarines. Now, Australia is a declared non-nuclear power, not just in that we don't have nuclear weapons, but also that we don't use nuclear energy. Apart from one research reactor in a Sydney suburb called Lucas Heights, we don't have any nuclear reactors, which means we don't have any capacity to actually make fuel for these nuclear submarines. So the idea is they're going to be powered and fueled by reactors that are supplied to us by the US. I'm not quite sure where the UK comes into this. Possibly the UK has some input as well, but these reactors will be sealed into the submarines. Australia will never have anything to do with the nuclear power. Presumably the US and UK will have to have something to do with the maintenance of these submarines as well. So effectively, even though we're buying these nuclear submarines, we are very much using their platform and very much dependent on their technology, dependent on their resources. Think of it as buying a Kindle book rather than buying a book. So now this has raised all kinds of questions in Australia about, does this violate our status as a non-nuclear power? Generally, the feeling is that it doesn't, because these won't actually be carrying fissile nuclear weapons. They'll be carrying conventional weapons, although certainly the Greens are going to argue in Parliament that this violates Australia's non-nuclear status. In addition to that, a lot of people are not happy about how quickly this happened. You know, it was kept secret in a remarkable feat of secrecy right up until the moment that it happened, although the main opposition Labor Party, Anthony Albanese, despite being someone who's opposed nuclear energy for decades, has basically said that Labor has no problem with it. So from our end, it certainly looks like it will go ahead. But this raises all kinds of questions. First of all, the UK returning to the Asia Pacific, like returning as a presence. I mean, apart from Hong Kong, the UK basically exited this region in the 1950s. What is the UK doing back here? Why does Boris Johnson feel the need to project British power into the Indo-Pacific, where it really hasn't been since people were getting around in shorts and pith helmets here? I mean, I don't know what quite is going on there. But okay, leaving that aside. So this is clearly designed to strengthen the US force posture in this region by its increasing Australia's military strength, but in a very specific way. In a way that I think essentially pre-commits Australia to getting involved if there is a military conflict between the US and China. Now, US officials have said that there is no quid pro quo. Lloyd Austin, who was the Defence Secretary, was actually asked this morning, what are you getting in exchange for giving Australia this, for sharing this technology with Australia, this technology that the US hasn't shared with anybody else since 1958. And Lloyd Austin said there is no quid pro quo, right? There's no pre-specified thing that we expect in return, except obviously the money that Australia will pay for these submarines. He didn't say that, but I just assumed that was implied. But I think really there's no other way to read this other than Australia has traditionally maintained the idea that it wouldn't get involved in an armed conflict between the US and China over the Straits of Taiwan. Now, I think this is sending a pretty clear signal that we would get involved, right? The only reason to have these submarines, nuclear submarines, they've got a lot of deterrent value, especially these ones, because they are very quiet, very hard to detect, and also being nuclear powered, they can stay underwater indefinitely. They don't need to surface. The whole idea of these submarines is that they're a deterrent, that if you've got these, it's going to make things very, very difficult for the enemy. This, I think that the only reason why the US is doing this is with an eye on future conflict between the US and China. And the idea is if Australia has these nuclear submarines, then China is less likely to be militarily aggressive because they're aware that a war would be just that much harder and that much more costly.
But why would China care if Australia has 12 submarines or 9 submarines?
Oh, they've got a lot of strategic value. It's more like 8 submarines, by the way.
All right, sure. But I mean, I would have thought the Chinese Navy would be significantly larger than worrying about 8 submarines. It is
in terms of the overall number of vessels. So I think the Chinese Navy has 69 submarines, but reportedly only 6 of those are nuclear submarines, which are particularly hard to detect. So, I mean, yeah, China's got a vast navy. It's the world's biggest navy now, but it's still considered, I believe, by naval aficionados to not be as powerful as the US Navy. And this sort of marginally strengthens that force posture. And the whole idea is it's going to be interoperable with the US Navy. So this is really strengthening the US Navy by proxy.
God. Okay. I am now going to try and see if I can get Dave back on in some capacity.
Oh, wow. That was a ride. Okay. So for those who missed what happened over the last 20 minutes is we got logged out because ABC was using some freebie Zoom and we got logged out and there was no one there in the control room because they're all at lunch because it's the ABC. And and so then I was racing around trying to find the place to find Zoom. And yeah, anyway, cut long story short, here we are. You're in the middle of talking about AUKUS.
Yeah. So I was saying something about submarines. I can't even remember where I was up to, but the big picture is that this significantly increases US strength in the region, but it's through Australia. So one of the things I find interesting about this is, Barack Obama complained towards the end of his presidency that allies weren't doing enough. This obviously for Trump was a central issue of his presidency, complaining that allies weren't doing enough, specifically NATO and Japan and South Korea. But Australia was never part of these discussions in either presidency about that we weren't pulling our weight somehow. But this move actually sort of represents a more significant increase of the burden on an ally, that is Australia, than I think anything that Trump actually managed to achieve. But it is one that Australia is assuming willingly as a solution to our submarine problem, and as part of the fact that China-Australia relations have been deteriorating so much over the last 2 years or so. I mean, 3 years ago when Scott Morrison became Prime Minister, he said that Australia wouldn't have to choose between the US and China. But now, because of a combination of all kinds of things, basically Australia siding with the US as relations between the US and China deteriorated during the Trump presidency. We've got our own issues around things like Huawei, around Australia demanding a more thorough accounting of the origins of COVID. There's a frequently talked about kind of values clash with China over human rights issues and all kinds of other issues. And this has led to a trade war between Australia and China, and it's felt by some in Australia that Australia isn't really taking much of a risk here because China's already played all of its cards when it comes to tariffs and quotas and otherwise stopping trade in Australian products. But yeah, this does represent, I think, a significant escalation both in Australia-China conflict and in US-China conflict. But this is the key thing. There isn't going to be a submarine actually entering the water for a long time, like at least until 2030. Now, a lot of things could have changed by 2030. Like Biden will certainly no longer be president of the United States in 2030. Xi Jinping may well no longer be the leader of China in 2030. And he is someone who has had a very distinctive leadership. Another Trump presidency could have come and gone by the year 2030. The point is all kinds of things could have changed. Maybe the US and China actually will have reached some kind of power sharing, uneasy settlement in Asia by that period. Maybe not. Maybe tensions will have escalated even further. But the point is, all of this is a long time away in terms of Australia actually getting submarines, whereas relations are just continuing to deteriorate now. And so, I mean, there's a lot of talk about this need for deterrence, and deterrence hawks have this consistent line in both Australia and the US, which is really strong deterrence is needed in order to prevent miscalculation by China. So Michelle Flournoy had an article about this in Foreign Affairs last year. It's something that you hear from the Australian side, from Peter Dutton, the defence minister, has said that there's a risk of Chinese miscalculation. And yeah, so as a result, we need this deterrence to stop further Chinese aggression. But we never talk about the possibility of miscalculation on our own side. Like, what is this actually doing in terms of what it then makes the Chinese leadership do? What does the Chinese leadership feel forced to do when confronted with something like this, when, you know, it has to play to a domestic audience that has certain expectations, also knowing that the American and Australian domestic audiences also have certain expectations. This is the problem with really ramping up the rhetoric and just escalating, is that you are dealing with domestic audiences that develop certain expectations about what's going to happen next. So I'd say, yes, there is a risk of miscalculation, but it is not only on the Chinese side.
But also, even if the calculation is correct, like you say, the deterrence is not going to be there for 9 years anyway.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
also
very common.
I think frequently there is this tendency, and there's been this tendency, you know, for the last 100 years to overestimate how easy deterrence is. Well, maybe not the last 100 years, but let's say the last 70 years. There's often been this belief that you see, well, because of, you know, all that you need is that overwhelming military power, that will be a sufficient deterrent. This is ignoring the number of wars that the United States and their allies have lost, despite having overwhelming military power. And there almost seems to be this kind of colonial attitude that, you know, countries like China, countries like Iraq, you know, they'll back down if you shake a big enough stick at them. That, you know, deterrence is just a matter of showing your overwhelming might, showing your overwhelming technology, and that will act as a deterrent. It's leaving out the fact that the likely areas over which conflict between China and the US would develop are areas that China sees as absolutely core to its own sovereignty and to its own identity. That's what Taiwan is for China. For the United States, it's always going to be a peripheral issue. For Australia, it's always going to be a peripheral issue, no matter how much people in Australia and China might care about the idea of Taiwan being independent and democratic. It's just never going to mean as much. It's never going to matter as much as it does to China, that sees it as an indissoluble part of China. And we've seen in Vietnam, we've seen in Iraq, we've seen in Afghanistan, it doesn't matter if you've got overwhelming military force. If you're fighting a peripheral conflict against another side that might be less equipped but is fighting over its core interests, you are going to lose. That was one of the lessons that we should have learned from Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, but we already seem to be in danger of forgetting when we're looking at a potential conflict with the world's second biggest military power. So I think Australia is going to have to think, I mean, fortunately there is going to be time to think, but it's going to have to think very carefully about, if it actually comes to something as serious as military conflict, whether Australia's national interests are actually involved in conflicts over places like Taiwan or islands in the South China Sea.
I feel like, I mean, I'm still very confused about this whole situation. Like, there's so many things that don't make any sense to me. Like, hopefully by 2030, the UK works out why they're in this deal. That would be nice. We're talking about like a security agreement, but it's just a trade of submarines. It's just a purchase of submarines. Is there some other aspect to it? There's something weird about this that we're not being told. I feel like in a way, the submarines is kind of beside the point. I feel like...
Well, I mean, I suppose the big thing is this is a technology transfer, at least to some extent. It's not actually entirely clear how much this is genuine technology transfer, but this is the US sharing technology that it hasn't shared with anyone since it shared it with Britain in 1958, right? That's a big deal. Okay. So South Korea wanted nuclear submarines. The US said no. So it is a big deal. Although, as I said, I think at the moment it's a bit akin to buying a book on Kindle in terms of we're using their platform, but you know they've still got control over it. In the same way that Kindle can remove books from its library, the US would actually have the power to cut this technology off.
And in the same way they did that in Afghanistan to the Afghanistan army.
Yeah. But this also, I mean, this reflects this sort of interesting nature of the alliance now, and also the way that mega weapons systems are made in the US, which is that it's almost like this club system develops in order to make weapons systems viable. So we saw this with the F-35, which is the fighter jet that it is probably going to, you know, the final price tag is going to be in the trillions. It's taken years to develop. It's been characterized by cost overruns. It's taken much longer than expected to develop. You know, by the time it's finished, it is supposed to be the world's most sophisticated fighter jet, although many question the need for it. But in the meantime, it's had a lot of problems with things like taking off or flying in the rain or dealing with birds. But anyway, because it was costing so much, even by the standards of these kinds of projects, in 2012, Congress said, I think it was in 2012, this is going to have to be exported to US allies to be viable. And so they set up this system where other countries could essentially buy into the weapons program on a tiered basis. And both South Korea and Australia bought into the F-35. So essentially kind of members of the F-35. We pay a lot for it. And that was one of the reasons why Congress actually kept funding this program. Yeah. So it is sort of the nature of being a US ally at the moment, is kind of buying into these weapons systems, which you get access to, but which the US still controls.
Yeah, this is actually where I was going, which is I feel like you referred to it as a club. I feel like what this is simply about is about Australia just declaring its hand as being part of America's club now. And ending the era of trying to balance between China and America, which we were sort of doing for a while there. And now this is just, as much as anything, a symbolic move to say, well, these are where America goes, we're going to follow. And so you're talking about what Australia's got to work out what's going to do with Taiwan. I feel like we're going to do what America does with Taiwan.
Well, yeah, I mean,
that's what we're just committed to.
Yeah. This is basically pre-commitment. Now, I don't know if we're still pre-committed if war breaks out before we even get these submarines that we're supposed to use. But yeah, this is a definite signal that Australia is pre-committed to that conflict, to siding with the US in that conflict.
Can I say, by the way, there's been a lot of mockery about the name AUKUS, but I think it's very easy to turn it from something weird to something really cool. If you just, rather than saying AUKUS, if you go orcas, like killer whales, they're the best. They're hardcore, man. That's what we need to do. Just call orcas, and that's great. Anyway, that's just a thought for, I'm sure Scotty's watching.
Just remember, as we've mentioned before on this podcast, in 2012, Mitt Romney's volunteering platform was called Orca, and it turned out to be the most disastrous platform in the history of the Republican Party.
So it was a killer. It was a killer just for him.
Yeah. Anyway, but no, I think that's a good point. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is declaring our hand. Yeah. Essentially. Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about the nuclear ramifications about whether it's breaching the nuclear restrictions and so forth, because during this exact same week, we've got, in both hot areas of the world, nuclear issues happening at the same time. You've got North Korea and South Korea both launching missiles, testing missiles at the same time, which is, that hasn't happened for a while. That's not a great sign. And you've got in Iran, you've got the International Atomic Energy Agency saying that Iran have now gained the capability to produce the fuel needed for a single nuclear warhead within a month. Now, that doesn't mean they'd have a missile in a month. The missile will take much longer. But still, they're getting close. They're getting to a point where, what you call the point of no return with this kind of stuff, where you're going to have some kind of standoff between America and Iran.
Yes. Now, interestingly, that's not an entirely bad news story, because this happens in conjunction with Iran actually agreeing to give the IAEA certain inspection and monitoring rights. So a lot of people see that agreement as a signal that they are willing to deal with the US. And the fact that this has come out about how close they potentially are to a nuclear weapon, it's like, yes, we're ready to deal. And by the way, this is what this is what we've got behind us now. So we're looking for a better deal than what we got previously. Of course, what the US is saying is, well, we can't go back to the deal that we had previously, because that was designed to deal with Iran when it was at a certain level of capability that's a lot lower than what it is now. So I don't know what is going to result from that, but I would say certainly, Iran is looking to get a deal fairly quickly. I just want to backtrack on something that we've said previously, because we were saying all this year, the US has got to do this deal quickly because elections are going to happen and a far more uncompromising regime is going to take place.
Yeah.
I now actually think that we were wrong about that. And I agree with the analysis that says, had the US done a deal with the old crew when they were on their way out, that would have had no legitimacy at all in Iran itself. It would not have been worth anything, and it would have been a non-deal that then it would have made it harder to negotiate with the new regime. So actually, I now believe that they were right to hold off until the new regime got to power, because they knew what was coming. They knew that any deal that they negotiated with the old government would not be seen as legitimate. This is the thing, about conflicts like these. You actually need to get the hardliners on board for it to have any meaning. If it's just moderates talking to moderates, then it's not really going to have any meaning. So I think, they were actually, although it is going to be hard, it would have been impossible if they had tried to negotiate a deal with moderates who were then replaced by hardliners.
Okay. Now, just a little thing here. Let's just do a stats nugget. Stats nugget. Okay. Now, this is a study from it's the Media Research Centre. I know what you're thinking. The thing about the Media Research Centre is they are very culturally, they're culture warriors from conservatives, just like Media Matters are culture warriors from the left. But what both groups have in common is that they do the numbers. Both of them do the numbers, actual numbers, and then they do their spin. And so, so sometimes they have some good, and this is an interesting one. This is a study from them. And it's not really about conservatism at all. It's very interesting. They surveyed hard news, right? Defined as a statement of fact, on-the-spot reporting. Obviously, there's a bit of subjective there, but still, just wait till you hear what I've got to say. 22.3% of all footage aired on cable news networks was what they call hard news, a statement of facts or on-the-spot reporting. That's 9 minutes an hour. Okay, 9 minutes 15 seconds of hard news for every hour of broadcasting. Interviews were 16% of broadcast news time, and the rest was commentary from a host or panels. 60% of the time was commentary, right, across the clock. At nighttime, 7 p.m. till midnight, 9.3% of the programs consisted of fact-based news reporting, which is even lower. And this was across all cable news, including the Fox, CNN, MSNBC, right? By comparison, 72% of the big three networks, that's ABC, CBS, NBC, their evening news broadcast was hard news. That makes sense. That rings true. Yeah. This is what I found really interesting. As a point of comparison, the fluffiest hour of the breakfast shows on the big three networks have a slightly higher percentage of hard news content than cable news programming does.
Wow.
How's that for a slogan? Slightly less newsy than the Today Show.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I thought that was incredible. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there.
And love to hear it. Look, I'm going to close on my own stat nugget. Yeah. And El Hadi that alerted me to this one. A new study from Pew about, among other things, looking at identification as evangelical Christian in the United States and support for Trump. Now, this study found, contrary to a PRRI study, which we've looked at earlier in a few weeks ago in the podcast, this study argued that evangelical identification actually increased in the United States from 26% to 29% from 2016 to 2020. And one of the key reasons for this increase was 16% of white Americans who didn't identify as evangelical in 2016, but nonetheless felt warm towards Donald Trump, identified as evangelicals by 2020. Now, it's possible that some of them did have religious conversion experiences or started attending evangelical churches, but more likely what is going on is that the evangelical label became so strongly associated with Trump that essentially Trump supporters decided that they should consider themselves evangelical, that this is part of being a Trump supporter. So just to repeat that, of all the white Americans who weren't evangelicals but were warm towards Trump in 2016, by 2020, 16% of those were identifying as evangelicals. That is a pretty big chunk. And that's a pretty significant finding from Pew.
doesn't that show that both religion and politics in America has become entirely cultural? That you,
I wouldn't necessarily say entirely cultural, but certainly the labeling of it has become very, very cultural. Yes.
Yeah, that's so once you're part of the group, you start to all the other aspects of the group begin to infect you, and so you take on evangelicalism or whatever other attributes you have from that particular group. Okay, anything else you want to add before you go?
I've got to go. It's bloody free Zoom's fault. We had this disruption. I'm sorry if I left out any key information about the submarines, but I'm sure that the peppers can find that information themselves.
You know what I love about that discussion though?
What?
I love that we didn't even mention my friend from down under, pal, Mr. Prime Minister thing, and we didn't mention it on the show either. We talked about AUKUS on the show for ages. We talked about AUKUS for ages here, and until I brought up then to note it, we didn't mention that incident once. Mwah! Nerds United. Woo! Okay, Dr. Dave. Thanks a lot.
Right.
And for our listeners, I will see you in a little bit of time for part 3 of this podcast Odyssey. Bye-bye. Hello again. And for those who are listening to the podcast rather than watching it, this probably all sounds normal to you guys, but I am actually back in the dungeon where someone has worked out a way to turn the lights on. And the internet's now working, which is extraordinary. It's just so exciting for me. And what's more, I was going to talk to you by myself for 40 minutes, but the difference between me speaking in a monologue in this podcast and me just being insane is just, it's too small for me to contemplate. So I rang up Melina, Dr. Melina for the purposes of this podcast, Melina Wicks, who hasn't even been following American politics in the last few weeks, and she had no time to prepare. She usually likes to prepare like I do, but she's just a good friend. So thank you very much, Melina, for stopping me from having to talk to myself for the next 40 minutes.
No worries, happy to help.
So for those who are listening, if you think Melina's been a bit quiet, it's because she has no idea about some of the topics that I'm about to bring up. And that's no knock on her. She has just been pulled from not even the reserves bench. She's been pulled from a different suburb. The game is going on. She's doing something else. She's doing her shopping and she's coming in and subbing in for me. So thank you very much, Melina. Let's get into it. I'm going to start now. Melina, absolutely. If you have anything to say about anything I've had to talk about, feel free to jump in. Yep. I will stop as soon as you jump in. Otherwise, I'll try and not be too boring to you. I did like, by the way, that you were so uncertain about what we were doing that you actually decided to physically film your feed in front of a door so you could escape as rapidly as possible if you needed to.
I just moved home, so I'm still trying to work out the angles for video calls of where to go. So I just found like the least conspicuous. I didn't want to show everyone my bookshelf without giving it a look over. So that's why I'm here.
Fair enough. You need your own dungeon. Okay. I want to start by talking about Congress, and in particular, I want to start by talking about the reconciliation bill, which negotiations are going on at the moment. This is the $3.5 trillion bill. $3.5 trillion bill, which is kind of a companion piece in a way for the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed through the Senate, at least. Okay, and the House at the moment are doing their own negotiating, and the Senate's doing their own. Last week, there was a lot of talk about Joe Manchin as if he was the biggest impediment because they needed 50 votes to get anything through the Senate. Joe Manchin is the 50th vote. I always say that Kirsten Sinema is also part of it as well, but people always focus on Joe Manchin because he's a bit more upfront with what he wants, a little less enigmatic. And Joe Manchin wrote an op-ed, which we talked about on Planet America last week. I'll just remind you, he said, quote, over the past 18 months, we've spent more than $5 trillion responding to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, Democratic congressional leaders propose to pass the largest single spending bill in history with no regard to rising inflation, crippling debt, or the inevitability of future crises. Instead of rushing to spend trillions on new government programs and additional stimulus funding, Congress should hit a strategic pause on the budget reconciliation legislation. A pause is warranted because it will provide more clarity on the trajectory of the pandemic, and it will allow us to determine whether inflation is transitory or not. I've always said, if I can't explain it, I can't vote for it. And I can't explain why my Democratic colleagues are rushing to spend $3.5 trillion. Okay, now, first of all, as I explained, if you're interested, you can watch the show in the fireside chat at the end of tonight's show. I mentioned why the inflation thing is a little bit overcooked. People tend to use purely the annual figures of the improvement of the increase in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and they're comparing it directly to what happened a year ago, which was a pandemic shutdown. So of course the prices are a lot higher than that. If you compare it to 24 months ago rather than 12 months ago, or you compare on a month-to-month basis, those numbers become a lot more manageable. But that aside, that inflation question aside, if you waited 6 months to work out what was going on with inflation, which is what you'd need, really, too late. We're in the run-up to the election then. So if you want to pass, don't worry, $3.5 trillion, if you want to pass $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion or $1 trillion worth of goodies, you ain't going to do it in June of a congressional year. So it's kind of now or never. So when he says a strategic pause, he's potentially talking about killing it off. So I can see why people are nervous when they read that. When I read that, I just think that's Joe Manchin trying to show how moderate he is, which is what he does a lot of. He likes doing that. Axios said that Manchin had set a price tag of $1 to $1.5 trillion, which is not something you do if you don't want to pass anything. It's something you would do if you want to negotiate, which would say to me that's a good sign. And look, I also get that Manchin has already said things he doesn't like about the $3.5 trillion package to people. He's expressed concern about the home care spending. He wants to means test the child tax credit. He wants to means test free community college. He wants to means test the universal preschool. He wants to means test the child. I already said the child care tax credits. Yeah, sure. Once again, they're things that the left might not want to hear, but that means he's negotiating, which is a good sign. It means he wants to pass something, right? I do concede that Manchin historically isn't great with the environment. There's a lot of environmental stuff in this bill. You know, he's made $4.5 million from coal companies in the last 10 years. So he's got some interest there. You know, he still holds stock options in a coal company, which is worth between $1 and $5 million, the amount of stock he's got in that coal company. So I am aware that people are nervous about him for this reason. And there's a quote that was doing the rounds the other day, which I thought, yeah, okay. The quote was, if you're sticking your head in the sand and saying that fossil fuel has to be eliminated in America and they want to get rid of it and thinking that's going to clean up the global climate, it won't clean it up. It won't clean it up at all. If anything, it would be worse, he says. Now, I don't know what he meant by that. And, I'm assuming what he meant by that, I might be generous to mention here, what he might have meant by that is that if America is the only country that reduces fossil fuels, then all that does is increase the supply and reduce the demand for the rest of the world, which would reduce prices of fossil fuels for the rest of the world, which would make the emissions rise. From an economic theory point of view. But of course, that's only if America gets rid of its fossil fuel emissions and no one else does anything, which I don't think would be the case. I definitely don't think that would be the case. I don't know what he meant. I was doing my best to come up with some kind of mental gymnastics for him there. But whatever he meant, sorry?
You're filling in some gaps for him there, I think.
Yeah, I probably am. Look, my point is I can see why people are nervous about Joe Manchin and the environment. I can definitely see that. But Joe Biden doesn't seem so worried. He said, quote, Joe at the end has always been there. He's always been with me. I think we can work something out. I look forward to speaking with him. I think Biden's right. Manchin, I can't remember a time when Manchin actually killed a piece of legislation. He does in the end go with his team. And like he complains a lot and he writes a lot of op-eds. And he turns up on Sunday shows going, such hard decisions. Oh, heavy weighs the crown. Like he does a lot of that. But in the end, he delivers his vote. So I don't think here's the issue. I think they do have issue though. I think the issue they have is that it's too easy for a very small group of people to defeat this legislation in the House. And that means a group of 4, 5 people can get together on any minor interest issue. If they've been lobbied by, like, it doesn't take much lobbying to lobby 5 Congress people, especially when they have some geographical interest, like people in their district all are from a certain industry or something like that. It doesn't take much. And before you know it, you've got 10 different groups of 5 people taking one piece after another out of this bill, and becomes extremely toothless. And I want to give you a few examples. By the way, do you have anything to say about Joe Manchin before I just leave him?
Well, just that there's nothing unusual about senators expressing opinions on legislation. And it's just because he is in this position where everyone sees him as the guy who can sink or swim any legislation, that every single utterance that he makes is sort of poured over and sort of analyzed to death as really meaningful. But, you know, any Democrat senator surely has things they like and dislike in any given bill. And he really has put himself in a sweet position to be the center of attention at all times. And everyone else's opinions seem pretty meaningless. And I guess that's not for no reason in terms of how, you know, Democrats have been voting. But as you say, he does ultimately vote with the team. So it is a little bit overblown, maybe the level of analysis of every opinion he has on a very broad piece of legislation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of examples of these groups, which I think are more of a concern than Joe Manchin. Okay, one, Biden had a plan. This is going to be a little hard to explain. Normally, when rich people buy an asset, say when they're 30, they'll buy a property or a farm or a factory or something like that. It will appreciate in value until they're 70, right? Then they die and they pass it on to their children. The way the tax works at the moment, if that child inherits that factory and then sells it 10 years later, they only pay the capital gains on the profits since they took it over, when they inherited it, right? For that last 10 years, not from the 40 years beforehand. Right? The capital gains from that 40 years beforehand gets extinguished when the person dies. That's how it is at the moment. And that's a way that rich people pass on very large amounts of money to their children. And that's the reason you get your Paris Hilton types that there's swimming in billions, Richie Rich style, because all those billions should be taxed for capital gains when it's passed on, but it's not. They only get taxed from the moment they get hold of it themselves. Okay. Biden wanted to get rid of that. Biden wanted to have a situation where for any capital gains over $1 million, you pay the tax for capital gains when you inherit it. And then you have the current system where once again, if you sell it later on, you pay another whack of capital gains, but for the section from between when you inherited to when you sell it. Does that make sense, at least to you, Melina?
It does make sense, but just a question, like, is there a reason why they would want to do it that way rather than just saying, you know, if you inherit something and then you sell it 10 years later, then you pay the 70 years worth of capital gains or whatever? Because surely that would make it more palatable for the people who likely to oppose a change like that.
I think the answer to your question why they haven't done that is because they want the money now. They want the money sooner rather than later. But yeah, but look, personally, I'd be happy if they did that. It's just as long as that capital gains aren't extinguished for good, I don't mind if you get it 10 years later or 20 years later or whatever, personally. But for whatever reason, that Biden wanted to have the situation, the policy I just described. What you got then was you got a whole bunch of lobbyists who said that they were campaigning on behalf of family farms. And they say, oh no, these poor people who inherit a family farm and they're asset rich and cash poor, you are charging them capital gains then, and they're gonna have to sell the family farm. Oh, now I should say there is an exception in this proposal for family farms. As long as you keep the family farm, you don't have to pay the capital gains until you sell it. Exactly what you just said. They have that proposal for the family farm in particular. But nevertheless, there are 13 House Democrats who represent farm districts who say that they're really worried about the situation of family farms. And so they got rid of that. It would have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars, probably more, probably billions of dollars, and they got rid of it. So that takes out some of your revenue. Another example is they were going to, this was a big one actually, I want to say billions, probably tens of billions of dollars actually. They got rid of it. Another example is drug prices. Biden had a policy, which you've probably heard before, about setting drug prices at levels derived from a basket of prices in foreign countries. So you go, okay, Canada, England, Australia, France, Japan. Let's look at the average of the cost of this particular drug in those countries. That's what we're going to pay in America, rather than America paying twice as much all the time or 3 times as much. When I say America's going to pay, I mean Medicare is going to pay. And because Medicare are the ones who really, that's where all the drugs get sold to the old people, essentially. And they budgeted with, say, $500 billion over 10 years on drug prices, because the government pays most of it because it comes out of Medicare. 3 House Democrats, just 3. Scott Peters of California, Kurt Schrader of Oregon, and Kathleen Rice of New York killed it in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as if anyone knows about that. But they killed it. Now Nancy Pelosi could try and bring it back over their heads in the General House, but 3 people, they just need to get one of their mates and they'll be able to kill it. So what's the point? If she's lost those 3, she's kind of pushing shit uphill. So there goes the $500 billion of extra revenue they could use to spend on some of their programs, right? Not to mention the fact that people wanted drug prices to be cheaper in America. That was a pretty big part of the bill. It's gone. Another one, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, the 33-member bipartisan, but mostly Democrat coalition against the SALT tax, which was the state and local taxes, which under Trump, they said you're only allowed to have a deduction of $10,000 for state and local taxes. Before then, you could have complete deduction of your state and local taxes from your income for the purposes of federal tax. But under Trump, they said you can only deduct $10,000 from your state and local taxes for the purposes of deductions in your federal tax. Now, why? What's this go to Democrats? It so happens that the places where state and local taxes are very high are blue states, California and New York in particular. That's where very rich people live and pay very high state and local taxes. So those very rich people in California and New York who essentially fund the Democratic Party, those people are saying to their members, hey, can you give us that tax break back again that Trump got rid of? And 33 members of Democrats, 33-member bipartisan caucus, most of whom are Democrats, said, yes, please. And a whole bunch of them have said, we are not voting for this reconciliation bill unless you get rid of the cap on deductions for the state and local taxes. That's going to cost $185 billion over 10 years. And all it's helping is rich people. It's got no value from a policy point of view whatsoever. It's just helping rich Democrat lobbyists and donors, essentially. That's pretty expensive. So from my point is that they've still got weeks to go. They've got weeks to go, and this process has already taken out the best part of $1 trillion worth of revenue, and it's going to continue on as people see, as lobbyists see the leverage they've got. They're going to keep on taking more bites, and that's the real threat to this bill, in my view, not Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin at least is responsive to criticism, and he needs to stand by his opinions on countless Sunday shows, whereas these guys don't need to respond to anyone. They're nameless, anonymous little groups of Democrats that no one's ever heard of who kill this stuff behind closed doors. And that's the stuff that really gets you. Do you have any thoughts about the reconciliation bill at all?
We just said it's, as you're saying, like the death by 1,000 cuts element of it, because Joe Manchin, like, even if you make big compromises to accommodate him, it's one person that you're accommodating. Yeah. But if you're getting to a point where you're having to accommodate 5 groups of 5 or 10 groups of 5 or whatever, then suddenly the amount of compromises you're making to get something over the line does sort of potentially just make the whole thing quite pointless.
Yeah. We'll see where it ends up. I mean, look, I'm sure they get something out of it, but yeah, to me, that's the threat, personally. Just a little side on Congress before I get into COVID. They're also talking about this Freedom to Vote Act, which is another mentioned bill, which I think isn't a bad bill, to be honest. I like it much more than the For the People Act, which was its predecessor. I won't go into too much detail now. I just want to say one thing, which is I really hope they get some voting reform up. And the reason why is because things might be about to get a lot worse. And I don't mean the way people normally mean that. They normally mean, oh, watch out for Texas and Georgia and all these red states. I mean, the way things can get really bad when it comes to the voting situation in America is when the Democrats give up, which I don't think they're too far away from. I think that if you have a situation where one side's been suckers, getting played by the other side, after a while, the first side just goes, you know what, two can play this game, let's go. And I'll give you an example, which I read the other day, and I just thought, oh, I don't like where this is going. New York Democrats are starting to think about gerrymandering New York. We've been talking about gerrymandering for a while. It's outrageous that people can draw their electorates to maximize their party's performance in Congress, which is what happens. It's looking increasingly, the Supreme Court's basically made it very difficult to have any kind of real gerrymandering reform, and it's getting filibustered through in Congress as well. The Democrats in New York are starting to say things like, starting to make the point that Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, these kinds of places have been gerrymandered forever for the Republicans. They can re-gerrymander again, but they can't get much more benefit than they've already gotten. Places like New York, which haven't been gerrymandered for a long time, if they decide to gerrymander it, that's a lot of bang for their buck. They're estimating that the Democrats can win 5 seats out of gerrymandering New York, which could make all the difference in 2022. And the New York Democrats are starting to send out the smoke signals going, do you want us to go for it? And I'm worried.
For Congress, like for national seats? Or?
Yeah, because what happens is the state legislature draws the seats for the national election. Yeah, so you have a situation where when you have a red state, like you have a situation like say Arizona or Wisconsin, where you have Republicans in charge of the legislature, and they've drawn their own seats so that they're not going to lose control of the legislature anytime soon. Like with Wisconsin, the Democrats would need to win over 60% of the vote in order to win the majority of the seats in the state legislature in Wisconsin. Once they're fortified like that, they then redraw the congressional seats as well to suit their party. And there's nothing you can do. Nothing you can do unless we can get past the filibuster. So anyway, as I said, Wisconsin does it, Arizona does it, Georgia does it, Texas does it. A lot of places do it, but New York does not do it until now. And my concern is, what I'm really worried about is if the Democrats give up and they just go, well, let's fight fire with a fire, we're never going to end gerrymandering. And like as soon as they do it to New York, there's just zero chance, I think. Anyway, so I just want to flag that depressing thought for you. So you can follow it just like I can. Do you have anything to say about Congress at all before we move on to COVID?
No.
Okay, all right. Okay, COVID. I'm not going to go through the stats. If you want to see them, go watch the show. Hospitalizations have started to drop, but does that mean anything? Because there's an interesting study from Harvard and Tufts Medical Center and the Veterans Affairs healthcare system. They analyzed records from nearly 50,000 COVID hospital admissions from over 100 VA hospitals. They defined someone as severely ill if they required supplemental oxygen or had a blood oxygen level below 94%. From March 2020 through to early January 2021, so before vaccination, effectively, the proportion of patients with mild COVID was 36%. From mid-January through to the end of June 2021, from mid-January through the end of June 2021, so before Delta, that number rose to 48%. So 12% more patients were having mild COVID this year in hospitals. So when they said hospitalizations, they're actually less sick. than they were last year. That was before Delta, so things might have changed since Delta. Obviously, out of vaccinated patients, 57% mild disease. That's no surprise. They said the reasons for this is that vaccination protects people against severe disease, even if they're infected by coronavirus, and the remaining unvaccinated patients tend to be younger and healthier. So when they're in hospital, they're less sick, maybe. That they also said hospitals have lower standards of admission when the infected population becomes younger and healthier as well. I've got my own suggestion. This year, they got on top of things until June. From basically February through to June, the hospitalization numbers were lower, so they could admit more people. When hospitals are full, they have to have higher standards. When they're empty, you can be more careful with who you look after, and so you don't need to be so picky. And I think that's what's going on myself, but they didn't think that. Whatever. Anyway, the fact is, when you see hospitalizations, it might not mean what hospitalizations meant more previously. When we're comparing, might not be comparing apples and apples when we made that comparison. Another thing about hospitalizations, Alaska's largest hospital on Tuesday started implementing crisis standards of care as well. In case you don't know what crisis standards of care are, Melina or listeners, that means that they start rationing who can get help. They're full, you turn up and you're sick, they decide whether you're going to get treatment or whether you're going to die because they have too many people. So now we've got Idaho doing it, now we've got Alaska doing it as well, which is a bit sad. And we are kind of at a depressing stage of COVID right now in general, because things are getting a bit ugly. And also the major participants in the international conversation at the moment are Joe Rogan and Nicki Minaj. And I want to talk about that for a second, because this is very depressing to me. First of all, I want to play a grab from Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan, for those who don't know, got COVID recently. He threw the kitchen sink at it. One of the things he got was ivermectin. He got better, and he kind of attributed it to ivermectin, not completely, but he was hinting that he thought it might be ivermectin. But in actual fact, he took Regeneron, which we know works. It works. It's like a 70% success rate if you get people early. So I think that's what helped him. But regardless, it doesn't matter. So they talked about ivermectin for a while, and then him and his guest Tom Segura had this conversation.
So what's going on with it's kind of hard to figure out what's the truth in a lot of things. But with regard to this, people go, it's insane to take ivermectin. You see it everywhere. Everyone's like, this is wild. Don't take this shit. And then you have the head of the fucking Tokyo whatever medical commission saying, take ivermectin.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, man. There's a lot of speculation. One of the speculations involves the emergency use authorization for the vaccines. That in order for there to be an emergency use authorization, there has to be no treatment for a disease.
Right.
So because there is this treatment in ivermectin, and there's other treatments too.
Right.
Because of this, there's a lot of pushback against potential treatments and pretending that they don't really work or that they're conspiracy theories. This is the grand conspiracy, right? The grand conspiracy is that the pharmaceutical companies are all in cahoots to try to make anybody who takes this stuff look crazy. But what's crazy is look how better I got.
Yeah.
I got better pretty quick, bitch.
Let's go.
And this drives me crazy because Joe Rogan is not a misinformer. He's not some dickhead who's trying to make money on Facebook like RFK Jr. or something like that. He's not trying to swindle people. He's just it's like me. He's trying to do the best he can. He does the research he has the time to do, and he's just doing his best. And he did say it was a conspiracy theory as well, to be fair. But everything he's saying is complete bullshit. So it's just making you so angry. First of all, of course he's better. He took Regeneron, which makes you better. Secondly, he's saying that the vaccines haven't been approved yet. Yes, they have been approved. The vaccines have been approved. They've got proper FDA approval. It's not emergency use anymore. So there's emergency use theories bullshit. Thirdly, Regeneron was around before the vaccines, and that does treat you successfully. So the idea that you can't have an emergency vaccine if there's a treatment around is bullshit, because the treatment was there before the vaccines turned up. Okay, so that's all garbage. And also, the vaccine's still useful even if there is a treatment for the virus. because you can only treat the virus after you get the virus. And after you get the virus, who knows what other side effects there might be. Even if you're cured of the virus, the vaccine stops you getting it in the first place in some cases. Right? And it stops it spreading, and it stops it mutating and creating more variants, and there's all kinds of stuff. So anyway, so everything he's saying there is unmitigated bullshit. But he has this massive influence, and he was all over the media, and he's kind of become exhibit A for the success of ivermectin, which just drives me crazy. Then you got Nicki Minaj, who she tweeted out a couple of days ago, my cousin in Trinidad won't get the vaccine because his friend got it and became impotent. His testicles became swollen. His friend was weeks away from getting married. Now the girl called off the wedding. So just pray on it and make sure you're comfortable with your decision, not bullied. Now, she's not anti-vaccine. It sounds like she's there, but she then went on to tweet, a lot of countries won't let people work without the vaccine. I definitely recommend they get the vaccine. They have to feed their families. I'm sure I'll be vaccinated as well because I have to go on tour, etc. So she's not like once again, she's not trying to misinform people. She's just an idiot who's talking about her cousin's friend having bigger balls because the vaccine went. COVID actually does that. That her cousin's friend might have gotten COVID. That is one of the potential side effects with COVID. Right? Not to mention he could have had an STD. It could have been any reason why that happened. And she's out there pushing this shit. And normally I'd ignore that, just a bit of color, who cares? But she's talking to the White House now. And the poor old Trinidad health minister, did you see that? He had to follow up.
Claims are being made. One of the reasons we could not respond yesterday in real time to Ms. Minaj is that we had to check and make sure that what she was claiming was either true or false. And unfortunately, we wasted so much time yesterday running down this false claim. It is, as far as we know, at this point in time, there has been no such reported either side effect or adverse event.
So there are real life consequences of this stupidity, right? And the thing that's and also I've seen so many protesters citing Nicki Minaj now, like she's some kind of seer, because it just makes you cry. And anyway, the reason I brought all this up is that, oh, by the way, for those who are listening to that clip I just played of the poor old Trinidad health minister who had to spend a day trying to follow up whether people's balls were getting bigger because of the vaccine, they had a sign language translator on. I want to see that full press conference when he's talking about the supposed symptoms, what that sign language translator is doing. Anyway, I want to talk about the broader trend of what is going on here, where people not just are listening to Joe Rogan and Nicki Minaj, and not only they became valued commentators on health matters, but people are preferring them to the experts. People are choosing Joe Rogan and Nicki Minaj because they're authentic over Fauci and over the FDA and the CDC and so forth. And they're not even pretending to be doctors. They don't want to be doctors. They don't want you to follow them. They're just saying what they think, which is fair enough. And they've got all these disciples that they don't want. And I understand that the experts have just been discredited at times. But I don't want to tell you my theory about this, and then I'll have given you enough time to think of yours. My theory is that there's kind of a collective blame going on these days. There's a collective blame. I think we're in an era of collective blame. Democrats are all the same, say Republicans. Republicans are all the same, say Democrats. The media are all the same, say all activists. The elite are all the same, say the non-elite. Scientific experts are all the same, say the non-scientific experts. And if one is bad, they all become bad. If Fauci makes a mistake, all scientists made a mistake. If a Republican is a hack, all Republicans are hacks. And it's just, and I'm not sure if this always was the case, but I feel like our society is becoming less capable of dealing with nuance these days. And I personally blame social media. And I think the reason I blame social media is because I think it elevates the voices of the dumb I think the dumb have always been there, but we didn't used to listen to them. Whereas now, when an idiot says something that gets 10,000 likes, then it ends up in a newspaper and it gets much more attention than would have happened 20 years ago. We would have ignored that idiotic thing 20 years ago. Now it becomes a valued part of the commentary. And I think that's making society as a whole dumber and less, and giving it less ability to deal with nuance. And I feel like that is part of what's informing this trend towards, in my view, collectively viewing everything as just a solitary unit, or each group as a solitary unit. And the reason this worries me is because I feel like we've ended up in a place where the Middle East and Russia were 15 years ago, where there is zero trust out there from a whole part of society, not everyone, but from a large group of society. There's zero trust. And when you believe in nothing, you can believe in anything. And that is a really bad place to be. Yeah, they're my thoughts. That's my soapbox. What do you think?
I don't disagree with anything you said, but I think I have like an extra theory as to what's going on with these kind of dynamics, especially people like Nicki Minaj and Joe Rogan. Like Minaj's tweets, like she's not like trying to push an agenda. No. She's not anti-vaxxer. She's not trying to convince anyone to be. If you look at her tweets, she's clearly expressing her own personal doubts and concerns about the vaccine. She's kind of like, I want to do my research. I haven't had time yet. It all came about because she didn't go to the Met Gala this week because they required vaccinations. She's not vaccinated yet. And so she's just expressing, she's hesitant, like many people all around the world are, about this vaccine that is new, and she's expressing her own concerns. And I think Minaj and Joe Rogan, you can say both of them fit into the sort of culture of influencers online. And the whole kind of dynamic behind influencers and people who are very popular on social media is that you're breaking down the wall between celebrity and consumer, so that people who follow celebrities who are kind of in that space feel like they know that celebrity way more than you'd feel like you knew like an actor or a pop star 20 years ago. And the kind of conversations that Nicki Minaj is having on Twitter are the kind of conversations that people are having with their friends and family all around the world, just at home on the phone and stuff. I've had conversations like that with people in my life who were like, especially earlier on, were like, oh, I don't know, side effects, I'm a bit worried. And, you just kind of have those conversations with people where you try to convince them, here's like the good evidence and things like that. But those people are more convinced by their friends and family, offline, outside of the public eye, than they are but from a Dr. Fauci in most cases. And I think this is just that on a bigger scale, where Nicki Minaj is just like, oh, I'm a bit worried. And she happens to have 20 million people who think Minaj is their friend, and they're having a conversation with their friend. It's like, oh, I'm also a bit worried. And the danger is that because it is happening on such a scale, it becomes very influential, and you're seeding doubt in a lot of people's minds and encouraging people to do their own research, which may or may not lead them to productive sources for research. So it's not that it's not problematic for society, but I think that that's part of the dynamic as well, that we do have this culture now where celebrities encourage people to feel like they have a direct connection to them. And so people are expressing the kind of doubts that they express just on a personal level quietly amongst friends on this sort of big, broad public scale. The potential upside, like I understand your cynicism and sort of hair pulling over it, but you mentioned the White House reaching out to her. And on the one hand, it's like, oh, don't they have better things to do? But like on the other hand, if they give her good information and she relays that is a good, often the way that you do convince vaccine hesitant people is friends and family who have good information, talking to the people in their lives that are hesitant and trying to convince them on a more personal level, rather than an authority figure on the TV saying, do this, do that, who people don't kind of have any sort of sense of or trust in. So I think it's not the worst thing that the White House is reaching out to her, and hopefully something good comes of it. But, I do understand your cynicism.
Oh, look, given the situation we're in, I'd be reaching out to her too if I was the White House. I just more the situation we're in.
Yeah.
Sorry?
And she's not the first celebrity that they have reached out to.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just mourn the situation we're in. That's all. Let's go into Biden's COVID law. his recent rules. We're into some depth on this on the show, but I want to dive into it a bit deeper in a few other areas now, because that's what the podcast is for. I'll try to limit repetition from the show. First of all, testing. Didn't talk about this on the show at all. Biden's invoked the Defense Production Act, which means that you're basically leaning on private companies to produce things. You're ordering private companies to produce things for you, to spend nearly $2 billion on procuring 280 million rapid over-the-counter at-home COVID tests from multiple manufacturers. He made a deal with Walmart, Kroger, and Amazon to sell at-home rapid COVID-19 tests at cost. So they're going to save about 35% for the next 3 months. And he's expanding the free testing program at pharmacies. There's currently about 10,000 pharmacies who are part of this program. That all sounds good. I mean, we need, like, they've kind of dropped the ball testing a bit. The fact that America is struggling to get at-home tests out there still is kind of ridiculous, because you got to say, you look at Europe and they've just got heaps. Like Germany's got like 60 different brands. And in fact, Europe has tests that cost like $2 or $3 that are American, but the FDA hasn't approved for use in America. So that's a little odd. We've got a photo for you right there of one of those tests from the Netherlands. There were 30 different rapid home tests sitting at the FDA awaiting approval in February this year. Where are they? It's kind of weird. But anyway, but it's good they're getting onto it now, at least. There are, because obviously if you, at schools and places where people can't get vaccines, testing is essential. So people to get the people who have COVID out so they don't infect everyone else. There are two kinds of mandates in this order. Let's talk mandates. There's straight out vaccine mandates. They have religious exemptions for federal workers. 2 million workers have 75 days to get vaccinated. People working directly on a federal contract and in federal offices, but for private companies, have a mandate as well. It's about 5 million of them. Most of the employees in every healthcare facility in the country that participates in Medicare or Medicaid is about 17 million of them, but that does overlap heavily with the 5 million federal contractors I just mentioned. They all have a mandate as well. Vaccine mandate as well, with a religious exemption. Now, there's little legal doubt the federal government can control the conditions of who it employs and who it sells stuff to and who it pays stuff to. So legally, that's all pretty sound, those ones there. But then we have the trickier mandate, which is what all the controversy is about. The employer mandate. So this is all employers with 100 or more employees, private employers, have to require their workers to be vaccinated or undergo at least a weekly COVID-19 test. That's 100,000 companies we're talking about, hiring 80 million workers. So this is the big one. And they will supposedly be fined $13,900 per violation. The employers will also have to give workers paid time off to get vaccinated, or paid time off to recover from any side effects of getting vaccinated. Because lots of polls suggest the reason people don't get vaccinated is because they're worried about the time off from side effects. Okay, now we don't know the exact details because the rule hasn't even been written yet. We know that the Labor Department, through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, are going to work this out over the next few weeks. And when they do work it out, they're going to be sued to buggery. You can be sure of that. Okay, so before I go through the legals, do you have any thoughts about that particular mandate?
No, go with the legals.
Okay, I'll go to the legals, then you think about anything you have to think about. All right, we'll start with a constitutional question. Okay, is it even constitutional for the federal government to impose a mandate on private businesses, not people that have anything to do with the federal government? Like they're just complete private businesses. I guess they would argue it comes under the commerce head of power. That would be the argument. Well, Steve Breyer, I can tell you, would disagree, because in 2012, he explicitly argued in the Supreme Court case that, quote, if it turned out there was some terrible epidemic sweeping the United States, quote, they cannot require people, even if this disease is sweeping the country, to be inoculated. The federal government has no power, he says. Now, he's presumably a vote they would need on the Supreme Court if they were going to get this up. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, this is not a vaccine mandate. So I think that's irrelevant. Personally, you might go, well, hang on, you just call it a mandate. Well, everyone's calling it a mandate, but I don't think it's a vaccine mandate because you don't have to get a vaccine. You can be tested. If you don't want to get a vaccine, just get tested. That's it. That's not a mandate in my book. The point I made on the show is you could just as easily call this a testing mandate with a vaccine exemption. Like you just have to do one of them. They should do that. I think Matthias on Twitter was saying people should do that. They should have been the Biden sale. But anyway, okay. So what's the truth here? I'm just speculating here. The truth is we don't know. Nothing like this has ever gone to the Supreme Court. This is new law. So we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say, because this will get to the Supreme Court, I promise you. That's the first thing. A lot of people are suggesting that there has been a case like this before. In 1905, there was a case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which a lot of people like to throw around, going, oh, the Supreme Court's already decided this one. No, they didn't. They decided a state vaccine mandate, not a federal vaccine mandate. There is such a big difference between those two things in American law. So we know states can do this, for sure. We don't know whether the federal government can do this, if you consider it a mandate. Which I don't, but maybe the Supreme Court does. Let's find out. Okay, let's assume it's constitutional. Let's go to the next step. What about the law that they're relying on? Okay, well, normally the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which they're using to pass this rule, it goes through a whole process normally, and that process is definitely legal. It takes everyone's views into consideration, dots the I's, cross the T's, takes a long time. According to the OSHA in 2012, the time from the start of rulemaking to the final rule ranges from between 4 years and 4 months and 11 years, 6 months. 4 years, 4 months is the minimum. So that's a problem. It takes forever. Now there's an emergency process you can go through for an immediate rule. That's the one that Biden wants to use right now. Lasts about 6 months though, theoretically. They might try and push that, but whatever. Let's say they're going to try and use it for 6 months, which is what you're meant to do. Okay. This is the law it's based on. Section 6 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act 970. I mentioned this on the show. The Secretary shall provide for an emergency temporary standard to take immediate effect if he determines that employees are exposed to grave danger from exposure to substances or agents determined to be toxic or physically harmful or from new hazards, and that such emergency standard is necessary to protect employees from such danger. So, is COVID a grave danger? I'd say probably. I don't know if the Supreme Court would agree. I'd say probably. Is it a substance or agent? Usually when they say that, they mean chemicals. If you look at the history of the OSHA, they usually mean chemicals. Not a virus, possibly. I don't know what the Supreme Court would say. Is it necessary to protect employees? Maybe. These are all questions the court's got to decide. I reckon one of the issues that they might face, maybe, maybe not, to me, it's an issue, is that there's no exemption for those who have natural immunity. When I say natural immunity, I mean people who've already had COVID, because the studies are very clear. If you've had COVID, that's at least as good as a vaccine, possibly better than a vaccine. So to say that someone who's had COVID needs a vaccine or testing to protect them or fellow employees from COVID is not true. I don't think it is necessary because they're already protected. So I think there should be an exemption myself for those who have already gotten COVID. You should just take an antigen test, one of those rapid tests I just said before. And if you can prove it, then you shouldn't get a vaccine. In my view, you shouldn't have to get a vaccine. And Ron DeSantis, by the way, this is his main point.
Many of these people have already recovered and they have immunity. The idea that somehow you have somebody that gets a Johnson & Johnson, they can work, but someone that's got natural immunity somehow can't, that natural immunity is strong. So it's not based on science. So
yeah, I think Ron DeSantis makes a fair point for that one at least. No one else cares. No one else agrees with me on that one, but that's my personal view. Another potential issue, this regulation I read supposed to govern the workplace. They're talking about conduct outside the workplace here when you're talking about vaccines. So does it apply? I think probably. I think it's probably still applies because obviously it affects you in the workplace. If people, in terms of whether legally, generally, people get away with this kind of stuff, it's kind of a mixed record. Of the 9 emergency standards issued between 1971 and 1983, and there hasn't been another attempted one since then until just now for COVID. 3 of them were not challenged at all. Of the 6 that were challenged, 4 were either stayed or vacated, so they kind of lost. 1 was partly vacated and 1 was upheld. So only 1 out of 6 that actually went to court was upheld. So it's not a great record, but I'll let the courts decide. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
I agree that we should include people who have natural immunity because the evidence generally does suggest that it's, probably, if anything, more effective than the vaccine. I mean, ideally, you get both, and you'd hope as many people as possible will get both. But
and if you do, you become Superman, apparently. Like, apparently, if you do, like, for real, like, I'm not making a Marvel joke. Apparently, you actually get the best immunity of all if you get both. Yeah. So go on.
One thing that I think is complicated in the whole debate about, vaccine mandates or, strongly encouraging people to get vaccines and, having all these restrictions in the workplace and stuff is that it seems like so far, at least, we're still not quite sure how much a vaccine prevents you from spreading the virus. Because if it's a lot, then the public health justification for having kind of heavy-handed tactics or laws to get people to take the vaccine, even if they're hesitant, is much more justified. Whereas if it doesn't really affect spread and it's more that on a personal level, it helps protect you from getting very sick, then that arguably comes down more to a personal choice thing, except with the big caveat that as long as kids can't get vaccinated, you have a huge portion of the population who we need to protect some way, and we can't protect yet with vaccines, which, then again muddies the personal choice element of the equation. And so, every time that I kind of think about all the various kind of proposals around vaccine mandates, and, you often have in a lot of the things we're talking about, even here in Australia, are kind of like not explicitly vaccine mandates, but kind of are by stealth, because it's like, well, you can only go back to your job if we're not making it mandatory, but you can only go to these events or go and do your job and living if you have been vaccinated. So, the incentives are very, very strong. And I mean, I would just love it if everybody got vaccinated happily by choice and we had full herd immunity without any kind of heavy-handed tactics, but it's pretty obvious that's not going to happen. And then we're in this really kind of awkward in-between space. And I feel like I'm really wrestling with it every time I look at any of these policies and try to think, what's the principled stance on whether this is right or wrong. It's so complicated because there's so much we don't know yet about, how much it affects your ability to pass it on. I think we get a pretty good idea that side effects, you're much safer off getting the vaccine than not. But if someone doesn't want to, someone wants to make a choice against that, is it fair to impose something on them which does have an effect compared to, say, like mask mandates where there's no potential negative effects at all? Not knowing the long-term effect on kids and just like how badly this will affect kids while they're still so vulnerable, and we're not able yet to know whether vaccines are safe for them. Hopefully they will be. Hopefully we can get everyone who wants to be vaccinated as soon as possible, but at the moment we can't. So, and then in the meantime, like while we're still kind of dealing with all this uncertainty, you have to make decisions now because virus is out there now, killing lots of people, infecting lots of people, overwhelming lots of hospitals. So you can't just kind of sit on your hands and be like, well, let's get all the evidence in and then we'll decide what to do. And in the meantime, the other alternative is lockdowns. And as someone who's vaccinated, I'd love to not be locked down as soon as possible. So I kind of feel like I don't want to be locked down for the benefit of someone who is refusing to be vaccinated. I will be prepared to be locked down to protect people who can't be vaccinated, but not for people who just aren't into it. So I think it's so complicated to assess the kind of how justified these policies are from a kind of a principled perspective when there's so much we don't know and everyone's kind of fumbling through trying to figure out how do we do the best by the greater good without violating important rights of individuals.
I'd just add two things to what you said there, which may help you juggle things in your own head. First of which is, while you're right that we have to make these decisions now, at least one of these decisions is going to become, I think, informed by events rather soon, which is that 5 to 11s are about to be approved with Pfizer vaccine in America. Like, it's looking like that's going to be within the next month. So that's going to be pretty soon. And in fact, they're saying that 6 months to 5 years old, we can expect approval this year as well, like at the end of the year, maybe December. So that issue is going to be taken off the table soon, relatively soon, but still not now. Second thing is, I have seen studies, not conclusive studies, but I have seen studies, which I've mentioned on the show or podcast or something at one point in time, about how spreadable the disease is when you're vaccinated compared to when you're not vaccinated. And apparently the viral load that is in your nose is comparable for a couple of days, and then it trails right off when you're vaccinated. Whereas when you're not vaccinated, it stays there for a few weeks. So basically, at your peak, you are maybe slightly less contagious if you're vaccinated, but only slightly, pretty much the same. But your peak lasts for a lot shorter a period than if you're not vaccinated. At least that's the impression of the study I saw. This was about 2 months ago now. But anyway, just you can carry that around with you.
I think also, the kinds of policies like you described where there's an alternative to vaccination. And it's like, it's a pain in the ass alternative that no one want to have to do, but testing won't hurt you. So that does solve that problem where it's like, you can not get vaccinated, but you have to jump through this annoying hurdle all the time. That's not going to hurt you. I think that becomes eminently easier to justify and less sort of fraught, because, employees have to wear, hair nets and gloves and stuff if they're preparing food, or, you have the employees must wash hand signs all over every cafe and restaurant in the US. And so that's kind of, I think, where you're getting into the much less fraught territory where, people who object to vaccines and object to these kinds of policies, then it's more on their personal convenience rather than impinging any actual kind of, I think, important rights.
I like that too. That's where I am. If it's rational, if it actually literally would make a difference, then I think being a nuisance is okay, but actually stopping them living their life is not okay. I don't think you should be forcing people to have to do something that they really, really, really don't want to do, and you give them no choice in the matter at all. Personally, but it's whatever. There are some practical effects as well. I should just mention quickly from this policy of Biden's. Who's going to pay for the tests? If the company has this testing regime for anyone who doesn't want the vaccine, those tests cost $50 to $100 each. Who's going to pay for them? Because that's going to add up real fast. We don't know. It's not covered by insurance. I'll tell you that. They don't cover employee testing. So someone's got to pay for it. Why wouldn't they lie or just get a fake card, these employees? Of course they would. Heaps are going to do that. The business can't prove otherwise, that's for sure. I'm sure heaps of people will do that. And yes, some workers will quit. It's already happened. There's from state mandates in New York, there was a hospital, Lewis County General, which said it will stop delivering babies because 7 resignations in their maternity ward from people who didn't want to get the vaccine. Personally, I don't want them working in a hospital if they won't get a vaccine. But anyway, and this hospital wasn't a big deliverer of babies anyway, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, sure, people will quit. Some people will quit. There are, as I mentioned on the show, 3.2 million people, according to Axios, who haven't rejoined the workforce since the pandemic because they're still concerned about COVID. So I think the people who quit will get outweighed by the people who come back into the workforce. But yeah, some people quit. The major thing for me though, even though for sure people are going to get fake cards and those lie, is I think this will have a huge practical effect for businesses, because businesses obviously want vaccines. Businesses, if you're a business, you want to get as many customers as possible. So vaccines are good for you. You want everyone to get back to work. Vaccines make you money, right? If you're a business. So of course you want vaccines. But if you're a business, you don't want to put a vaccine mandate down, because people will leave your company to go to a company which doesn't have a vaccine mandate if they're against the vaccine. And you'll get picketed by right-wing activists. You don't want that. You don't want to be the bad guy. You want someone else to be the bad guy, to impose vaccine mandates on you. That's what you want. And that's exactly what Biden has just done. He's become the bad guy so that Coca-Cola can have a vaccine mandate and not cop any shit. They go, oh, I'm sorry, we offer you free choice, but our hands are tied by the government. Like, that's great for them. And so I think if that's what they were trying to do intentionally, to take a bullet on behalf of business, I think that's a great policy. I think that's smart. And I actually think that because of that, because businesses will want to comply while pretending that they don't want to comply, I think it will give a lot of people an excuse to act, and it will make a difference, in my view. Even Fox News, I'm not sure if you saw this, but Fox have a vaccine mandate that is stricter than the one Biden just put down. Rather than weekly testing, they have daily testing for people who don't have a vaccine. So businesses want this, right? Also, it's popular. Morning Consult is 58% support. Interestingly, only 61% in the same poll supported local mandates. So what that tells me, 58% support federal mandates and 61% support local mandates. They don't care about the legal issues at all. They don't care about government, stay out of my pocket, or stay out of my bloodstream. They don't care about that. It's just about whether they care about mandates in general from anyone. They're pragmatic about it, essentially. So I think that's worth noting. Also, Axios had the same thing, 60% support, same result for local mandates. So the constitutional issues might be an excuse, but it's not something that people actually care about, I don't think. It's interesting, there's a polling trap, I feel, for Republicans here, because they've been very cynical about this. During Biden's remarks on Thursday, the House Republican caucus tweeted, quote, "The United States of America is the land of the free. Don't let anyone tell you anything else, not even our president." And then 9 minutes later, they tweeted, "Joe Biden has failed to protect the American people." So that's pretty cynical. Either you're about freedom, or you're either about freedom or you're about getting the virus. You can't be both. Right? You can't at the same time go, "Oh, Joe Biden, what he's doing is horrible," and Joe Biden hasn't done enough. That's very tough. And the reason I say it's a polling trap is because there was a Navigator poll, 48 to 37 said Biden is doing enough to fight COVID. And that was up 4 points since last week. Even 28% of Republicans said he was doing enough to fight COVID. And that went up by 5 points last week as well. 29 to 54 say Republicans in Congress are doing enough to fight COVID, including only 45% amongst Republicans. Not even the majority of Republicans are saying Republicans in Congress are doing enough to fight COVID. So I think the cynicism, that could bite them in the ass down the track. If Biden keeps on doing the heavy-handed mandates and Congress keep on just being pricks, eventually there's going to be some accountability down the road on this. And so I think that's something they need to watch out about. The only other thing I'd say about this area before we get into our final thought about Norm Macdonald, so I'll let you prepare your thoughts about Norm Macdonald there, Melina, while I'm saying this, is that there are two things the administration is doing that annoy me about this, which is just, they're minor, but I should just mention them. One, I hate the way Harris and Biden keep on saying they're trying to protect the vaccinated with mandates. I hate that so much. That's a terrible talking point. It undermines vaccines. If you're saying you need to protect the vaccinated, then you're saying the vaccines don't protect the vaccinated. So Don't do that. I hate that. And it's a stupid talking point anyway. It just sounds ridiculous. And secondly, it's a fact that there is a very complicated situation at the moment on the border when it comes to vaccines, where certain people have to get vaccines and certain people don't. If you want to apply for certain kinds of visas, you need to get vaccines. If you don't want to apply for certain kinds of visas, you don't. So some illegal immigrants don't have to get a vaccine and they come into the country anyway. You can see where this is going. So enter Pete Ducey to the White House press conference, as per usual, to Jen Psaki. He asks her, what's going on with these illegal immigrants who don't have to get the vaccine mandate, but private sector employees do? Once again, they don't need to. They can get testing, but whatever. Okay, let's go with the talking point and let's see what Jen Psaki had to say.
But it's a requirement for people at a business with more than 100 people. It is not a requirement for migrants at the southern border. Why?
That's correct. Go ahead.
I know that with enforcement, employers who refuse to implement the vaccine rules are...
That was her whole answer. That's correct. Next person. They're going to have to do better than that, I feel, because that is such an obvious rabble-rousing talking point. They're going to get smashed over the head with over and over again every month when another 200,000 people cross the border. And it's going to be another 200,000 this month as well. They really need to get that sorted. I can't believe it's just, they don't just have a mandate, a flat mandate for all the legal immigrants who are caught have to get a vaccine. Why wouldn't you? But if they're not going to do that, then get a better talking point than, yes, I acknowledge that you're correct. Moving on. Anyway, okay. Enough of that. Do you have anything to say about any of this before we move on to Norm Macdonald?
I'd say two things. One, I think that it is intentional, the Biden administration being the bad guy so that companies don't have to. And also so that states don't have to, in the sense, or more so that, so you, I appreciate the effort to not have this enormous patchwork of rules about where you have to get a vaccine and where you don't across the country, like whether it'll work or not, whether it proves constitutional or not, open question. It's more difficult for them to do it and, you know, more legally questionable than states or companies. But I understand completely the motivation and the kind of how much more ideal it would be if there was one federal law. And I think it does do a big favor for companies which did want to be able to enforce this without having to actually enforce it. So I think it's smart from that perspective. And the other thing was just on me talking about people making that argument about how people will fake vaccine passports, which I've heard a lot of, and in Australia as well, you know, people saying we're going to have more freedom to vaccinate people, and people being like, oh, like people are just going to fake it. That is, I think, the stupidest argument against a policy like that. Whatever you think of vaccine passports for any other reason, the fact that some people will fake them, which of course they will, and I've seen, you know, articles, you can pay $200 on the dark web to get a perfect vaccine passport. You can fake stuff to break literally any rule in the world, and people do. Like we're not supposed to be more than 5 kilometers from our home. We're not supposed to go to work unless it's essential. You can fake a doctor's letter saying that you can't wear a mask. You can fake an employer letter saying you need to be out and about. You can be more than 5K from your home, and unless a cop happens to stop you and check your ID, no one's gonna know. You can get a fake ID to get into a bar when you're under 18. Like, there's infinite ways to break every single rule on the planet. So the fact that some people will break a rule, like, means we should not have a rule, or the rule is inherently invalid, is just an extremely stupid selective argument that I hate. So just wanted to say that.
I reckon you stabbed that one in the heart. You got that argument nicely, I reckon. Okay. Final thought. I'd like to just leave this podcast with some thoughts about Norm Macdonald. Now, that's something. Oh, okay. That's what happens when you record a podcast in the ABC. I'm not sure if you heard that, but if you did, there was a bird that flew past, a human bird cawing like a crow. I don't know if it's just me and my age, because Norm Macdonald was very big on SNL when I was a teenager, but Norm Macdonald's pretty big for me. I can't imagine you need much preparation for this one, Melina, because you're a comedy writer, so you know plenty about Norm Macdonald yourself. You might as well start off. What are your thoughts about Norm Macdonald? Were you a fan?
Yeah, and it's just, I was shocked because like everyone, it turns out he kept it secret for 10 years that he was really sick. I had no idea he was sick. It really came out of the blue, and it's incredibly sad.
Yeah. It's, I mean, that's part of, it's just such a Norm Macdonald thing to do, to just go, you know what? It's weak to tell people about this. I'm just going to keep it to myself. And he's so, he's difficult. He's difficult. He makes himself difficult, which is one of the great things about him. I mean, like, you look at his career, and he intentionally just made people's life difficult over and over again. It was what was so great about him. Like, even at the expense of his own career. Like, for instance, the reason he got thrown off Saturday Night Live was because he knew that the boss, that the local boss of NBC was O.J. Simpson's best mate. And yet there are 40-minute collections on YouTube of the O.J. Simpson jokes he made on SNL after he knew he was going to get fired from SNL if he kept on making O.J. Simpson jokes. So just
aged well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like you just every single, just keep on just nailing it, just licking that ulcer just over and over and over and over again. It was just so good the way he just gave his way to piss them off. You know, like he was on The View, and he hated Barbara. Yeah, he hated Barbara Walters because he as far as he was concerned, she represented celebrity tabloid journalism, and they came in making a thing out of the fact that he'd had a photo taken with George W. Bush, like he cared. And he thought, okay, you want to go political? Let's go political. And he just started going about Clinton murdering people, and he didn't let up for 7 straight minutes. He just didn't let up. It's just great.
I would really suggest, I've been watching old clips on YouTube of him lately, and I would suggest that people look up Norm Macdonald, The View, because from the very beginning of that interview, it's quite clear that Barbara Walters doesn't like him, and yet she somehow hates him more and more with every passing moment. And it's a remarkable achievement.
I'm going to put a link in the homework so you can have a look, and I'm going to put a link to the interview with Tom Green, yeah, where he explained what was going on behind the scenes, you know, which is also worth watching, which is great. Yeah, that's fantastic. What else? I actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish off by putting my favorite routine of his up, which is the Bill Cosby one. You seen the Bill Cosby routine? I must have sent that to you. No? Okay. Well, listen to the podcast, Melina, and you can listen to it at the end. It's a really, really good routine, the Bill Cosby routine. But yeah, no, the fact that he was, I mean, there's a kind of Norm Macdonald kind of joke, which was to just state a fact, like the classic Norm Macdonald SNL joke was about Julia Roberts divorcing Lyle Lovett, and he said, I think the critical moment was when Julia Roberts realized that she was Julia Roberts and he was Lyle Lovett. It's just such a classic sort of Norm Macdonald style joke where he just states just the fact, and the fact in itself is funny when you put it in a certain context. It's and the fact that he did that a lot, making humor out of facts, and he'd do it in your face in a way that made the person he was talking to look kind of stupid at times, and he didn't care. In fact, he relished it. He relished the awkwardness, and the people he got along best with were the people who loved that he would make them look like an idiot. Like Conan O'Brien, he got along so well with, because Conan O'Brien loves being the butt of the joke on his show. And it's just, yeah, he's just brilliant. Anyway, do you have any other thoughts about Norm Macdonald before I play the Cosby routine and wrap it up?
No, everyone enjoyed the Cosby routine. Yeah. I will too.
Thank you so much, Melina, for making me not talk to myself for over an hour. It was very, very kind of you. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who persisted with this podcast till the end, despite the very rocky terrain that we've been traveling. Hopefully, we've got one more week before we take a little break. Hopefully this week will not involve Dr. Dave having a dialogue box over his face for 10 minutes and us having to restart the podcast 3 times because of technical issues. Thanks all, folks. And just in case I forget next week, like I will, go Dogs for next week. Oh, I'm so excited. See Melina and RIP Norm Macdonald. Bye-bye.
Hey, listen, Bill Cosby, first of all, is my hero ever since I was a kid, because I always wanted to be like him, and I got his albums, tried to emulate him, but I didn't like his stand-up, but I like the way he was as a man. Because this was before, they didn't say he was a rapist on the fucking liner notes of the albums, you know? As my buddy said, he said, the worst part about Cosby was he was a hypocrite. And I said, I don't think that was the worst part. To me, the worst part was the raping. Way up high. And then the second would be the drugging. And then the third would be the scheming. But anyways, hypocrisy would be way fucking down the line, you know, like on the 4th page or some shit. Like, I'm no expert, but I think probably most rapists are hypocrites. You know what I mean? You don't meet a lot of guys who go, I like to rape, I don't give a fuck. I know it's not a politically correct thing to say, but I like raping. Go, God damn, at least he's not a hypocrite. That's the worst. That's the worst part of it. But he, imagine you're a girl. Some of you will be easier. No, imagine you're a girl. You're in a gift shop in Vegas or some shit. You go, I'm gonna buy this snow globe for my. Oh, it's the most famous guy ever, Cosby. You know, Cosby's there, and he's like, "You want to go to my room? It's the biggest room ever." And so you go, "Yeah, of course I want to go to your room. Biggest star ever, biggest room ever. What the fuck? You don't even have to be a girl. You fucking go." And then you go up, and then you're like, fuck, look at this. I've never seen... And he's like, you want a glass of water? You go, yes, that would be nice. And then you go, why is it purple? Why is it fizzing? Like in a monster movie. Just drink it. It's famous people water. And you drink, and everything goes fucking crazy and shit. And they come out of it, they're like, what the fuck? I was just in the gift shop. What's that? Cosby cock? I can swear that's a Cosby cock. That's impossible. A Cosby cock? Why would there be a Cosby cock in my face? Wait a second, I remember. I'll call for help. Hypocrisy! A man committed hypocrisy on me in room 10304-204. There's too many numbers in the hotel room. God damn. Cosby. But when you think about that show, people go hypocrite and shit. But in a way, when you think about the show he had a regular fucking life, but then what was his job? He looked in women's pussies and stuff. And you never saw it. They never showed you that part. So in a way, maybe he wasn't a hypocrite.